The Bible says they'll gather an army of 200 million. Well, John was astonished because the whole population of the Roman Empire was 200 million. How could you have an army of 200 million? But now we know that since 1978, in China, with the one-child policy, they have a gender imbalance of male and female that is absolutely unprecedented in human history. There are provinces of China where there's 125 boys for every 100 girls. It is estimated now, in an article in the Toronto Star, Canada's national newspaper, in 1997, that at that point they had 75 million excess young men of military age in China with no women for them to marry. It's now over 110 million. And that's in China alone. Imagine 110 million men who are of military age with not a single hope, rationally, of ever finding a wife. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese girls are kidnapped by gangs every year in China. There are reports on this on the internet and newspapers, that the gangs kidnap them and then sell them to farmers so that their son will have a wife and hence children to continue the farm and the tradition. They rescued over 40,000 women in China from kidnap gangs last year alone. Now in India, where there's no one-child policy, because of the burden financially of paying a dowry when your daughter gets married, which is equal often to 2 or 3 years' income, parents really don't want daughters. It is estimated by the Indian government that 99% of all abortions in India are abortions of unborn female children. So they keep aborting until they have a male and bring them to term to have a male baby. In South Korea, in Burma, similar phenomena are taking place.
So you're describing these nations as the kings of the East?
Yes, and for the first time in human history, you can see where the cannon fodder of an army of the kings of the East for Armageddon of 200 million can actually, literally come to pass.
Now, when does the Bible prophetically speak that that will come to pass?
In the year leading up to Armageddon and following through Armageddon.
So is this the great war that Ezekiel speaks about called the Battle of Gog and Magog?
I do not believe that is the one at all. Everything about the War of Gog and Magog tells me that it's a separate war that is probably 7 or more years before Armageddon. The weapons used are totally different. The individuals involved are totally different. In Ezekiel's war, which involves Russia and all the Islamic nations against Israel, it's God himself who supernaturally from heaven
just for clarification,
destroys.
when we speak of Ezekiel's war, that's what Ezekiel referred to when he said the Battle of Gog and Magog.
Correct.
So this battle is what you're describing.
Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes a war that I believe is before the 7-year tribulation. We could, as Christians, be here to see this. And when it occurs, it's God who destroys the Islamic Russian armies, saves Israel, and the whole world is now no longer atheist because they have seen the manifest presentation of the supernatural power of God to save Israel. Israel will recognize it's God who saved them, and I believe will thereby build the temple. The Islamic world will be in shock having seen that the jihad was defeated by God and will acquiesce. What we see is there's no mention of the Messiah in Ezekiel's war. There's no mention of the Antichrist either defending Israel or betraying them by not defending them. But when we look at the War of Armageddon, which is at the very end of the 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist has taken over the world. Now the kings of the East gather together to fight him and march a 200 million man army across Asia, because there's not enough trucks or trains for 200 million men and their equipment. No. They march, and the Bible says that the way of the kings of the East would be prepared. Our audience probably doesn't know it, but they could go on Google if they want, or any other search engine, and see that a military highway like our interstates in North America has been built right across China in very uninhabitable mountainous areas that they've lost 100,000 construction workers to accidents. It's going from China through those nations of Asia toward the Middle East. And it has no economic value. Businessmen are not allowed to use it. Western tourists are not allowed to approach it. It is all documented. And here's something else. John in Revelation says that when the army of the kings of the East, following the way of the kings, that military pathway, when they get to the Euphrates River has been a military barrier between East and West for thousands of years of history. But the Bible says, in the words of John, that the Euphrates River is going to dry up for the first time in human history. And this army is going to march dry shod across, heading toward Israel, toward where the final battle will take place. For the first time in history, this can happen. The Turkish authorities have built the Ataturk Dam, the largest dam project in the world. And by pressing a button, They can cut off the waters of the Euphrates at the headwaters, and the Euphrates would dry up totally. Now, when that army crosses Asia, the Bible says in Revelation it destroys 1/3 of humanity in its path. This army of unmarried men will be a horror for what happens in that time. Now, obviously, the Antichrist and the Western allies are not going to wait until they reach Israel before they start attacking. I believe the war will take place for a year or two, and it will culminate in northern Israel. In the valley of Jezreel, the place at Megiddo called Armageddon. It is a huge valley that extends 200 miles down, ending down here. Napoleon, in 1800, when he invaded Egypt, came up here to Palestine, to Canaan, to Israel, he stood at Megiddo. And where he stood at Megiddo, he looked out on this plain and he said, the armies of the world could marshal their forces in this vast valley, the most ideal battleground in the world, he said. I have stood at Megiddo, as I know you have, and I've looked out with powerful binoculars. And out at a very great distance, there's a V. There are runways that come out like this. From underground, there's an enormous underground airport under Armageddon, where Israel has military planes in an underground subterranean airport, military. When the planes come to the surface, they're already in the air. And we've actually seen planes fly out. It is an amazing thing when you look at these prophecies, many of which have never happened at any other time in history. Many of them could never have happened technologically until today. And by their nature, I say they are unique. Think about this hypothetically, if this is not the generation when Christ said he'd come.
Yes.
Since the Bible says when Israel is reborn, he will come. When the language of Hebrew is restored, he will come. If this is not the generation, David and Barb, then Israel would have to be exiled from the land. They would have to forget Hebrew. And they would then have to come back centuries later, recover Hebrew, and recover a state. The Bible gives no chance for that because Amos chapter, the last, verse 14 and 15 says that when Israel is brought back in the land and their captivity is ended, God said, I will never again allow them to be exiled.
The
These are the signs.
prophetic signs certainly point to the fact that the last days have begun.